Hi everyone, we're as always Arne and Carlos, and welcome to week one of the festive knit along. And today we have revealed the first pattern, which is called the Snowball.
So this week you have to make 4 of these if you want to do the cushion, or 8 if you want to do the blanket. And the inspiration behind this is the 8-leaf rose, or you can see it on the ball actually, or on the square, the 8-leaf rose, or the 8-pointed star, some people call it. And we put it on a snowball because,
Snowball fights in December.
We fight with the snowballs in Norway.
It's a lot of fun. The first snow. It's a symbol. It's to symbolize the first snow and how wonderful it actually feels. Come May, we are fed up with snow, but in December it's fun to go out and have a first snowball fight and make angels.
Yeah, and you can make but you can also make snowball lanterns. I don't know if all of you are familiar to that, but we normally in the winter, we do snowball lanterns where you just put one ball on top of each other and you put a candle inside.
It's lovely.
It's very decorative
and very Norwegian. So that's the first clue, and we hope you will enjoy knitting them as much as we enjoy designing them.
Yeah, we're going to keep you busy this week.
All right, so stay tuned for next week's review.
All the squares in this knit along are stranded colourwork, a beautiful technique where you knit with more than one colour in the same row, carrying the yarn that you're not using along the back. The instructions for each square are provided as a chart, which is just like a picture of the right side of your knitting. Each square of the chart represents a stitch, and each row of squares represents a row of your knitting. Because we're knitting flat squares alternating between knit rows and purl rows to create stocking stitch, we're going to read the right side rows, the knit rows, from right to left, and the wrong side rows, the purl rows, from left to right. This is because when we're on a purl row, we've flipped the knitting, so we're now looking at the back of it. To keep track of where you are in the chart, use something like highlighter tape or a ruler or a piece of paper and just move it up each time you complete a row. To follow the chart, you're simply going to work each stitch according to the key. If there's an empty square on this chart, I'm going to work that in colour A. If there's a dot, it's going to be in colour B. You'll notice that there are 39 stitches in the chart. However, the pattern instructions ask you to cast on 2 extra stitches, so that's a total of 41. This is so that you can add an extra stitch up each side of the square, creating a column of knit stitches, which gives us a seam allowance when we come to sewing up. So start every row with an extra knit stitch before beginning the first stitch of the chart, and then remember you'll have 1 extra stitch to knit when you come to the end of the row on the chart. These extra stitches should be knitted no matter whether you're on a knit or a purl row, and this will give you a nice column of garter stitch to sew into later on. So we start by casting on 41 stitches. I'm using the cable cast on method here, but you can use any cast on you prefer. And then we're ready to start the first row of the chart, which is a knit row, so we're starting over here. And you can see that it's all in one colour, it's in my colour A. I'm going to use this first row to add some stitch markers because I find it quite helpful to have stitch markers just to help me keep track of where I'm at in the row. So I'm going to start by knitting my first stitch, which is my edge stitch and is not featured in the chart. I'm going to knit that stitch and then I'm going to pop a stitch marker on to there, just so that I remember that this next stitch is the first stitch in the chart. Then I'm going to knit 10. We've got 10 stitches up until this line, and I'm going to pop in another stitch marker. I've finished my first row and I've got all my stitch markers in the correct place. So I've got one on either side to remind myself that there's an extra stitch before the chart starts and at the end of the row. And I've also got stitch markers every 10 stitches. There's 10 stitches here, 10 stitches here. I've put a different type of stitch marker in the middle so that I recognize when I get to that one, that is the center of the chart. Then I've got 10 stitches here, and here we just have 9 stitches before the end of the chart. So I've just got a gap of 9 stitches before the final stitch marker there. And now I'm ready to start my first row of colour work, which is going to be a purl row. So we're starting over here and we'll be working in this direction. First stitch of every row is always a knit stitch, so I'm just going to knit that one, slip the marker, bring the yarn forward ready for my purl row, and now you can see I'm over here and I'm starting with my yarn A. So purl that first stitch, and then I'm ready to introduce my second colour, yarn B, for 3 stitches. So I'm going to leave a nice long end here so that I have plenty to be sewing up with. Insert the needle to purl, and I'm going to hold on to that end between my thumb and middle finger on my left hand and purl that stitch. Then I'm going to purl 2 more, and then we're going to drop that colour and go back to yarn A. Now you can see I'm over here, I'm back to 3 of yarn B, then I'll swap to go to yarn A, 3 more of yarn B, and every time I'm changing colour I'm just going to drop down 1 yarn and pick up the next. So I'm dropping down yarn A, picking up yarn B and working that for 3. Drop down yarn B, pick up yarn A, and I'm at my next stitch marker, so I'm just going to slip that over. So I'm now here, and I'm going to purl 3 in yarn B, drop that down, pick up yarn A, and each time I just want to stretch that out to make sure that I'm not pulling these too tight, because you don't want your work to be all puckered. So stretch it out and make sure that there's enough space between the stitches. I purl that, drop it down, pick up yarn B again, 1, 2, 3, and at this point I can see where my center stitch marker is, so that's this heavier line here. So this is a good place to just check that I haven't gone wrong. So I can see I've got 3 stitches left, so this is looking okay. I've got 1 in yarn A and 2 in yarn B before I get to my stitch marker. So again I drop down yarn B, pick up yarn A, make sure I'm not pulling too tight. Yarn A goes down, yarn B comes up, work those 2, slip the stitch marker, and then I've got 3 more of yarn B. Now here we've got quite a big gap between the 2 stitches on either side that use yarn A. So it's fine if you have small gaps where you don't use a colour, like 3 stitches here. You can stretch that across and that's no problem. If you have more than, say, 4, then you probably want to catch the yarn that's not being used in the back. We call this catching in a float. So these strands at the back here are known as floats, and what we're going to do is just trap that yarn securely so that it doesn't cause a big long line that can then catch on something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, even though I'm not going to be working with yarn A for a while, I'm going to put that over the top of my yarn B, and then I'm going to work yarn B, and you'll see that it catches in the yarn A so that it doesn't have there's not too much of a long strand at the back there. I'm going to work 3 in yarn B, and before I work my next stitch in yarn A, I'm just going to stretch that out and make sure that it's not being pulled, but you can see how yarn A has been caught there in the back. So we purl the next stitch, and then I can go back to the usual rhythm of 3 in B and 1 in A. And you'll notice at the end of each row that your yarns have got twisted up around each other. That's fine, just take a moment to untwist before you start the next row. Yarns untwisted, highlighter tape moved up, and we're ready for the next row, which is a knit row, so we're going to be starting over here. I'm going to knit my first stitch, which is not on the chart, slip over the stitch marker, and then begin with the first square on the chart, which is in my colour A. Next is colour B, so I'm going to drop that down, and I'm going to pick up yarn B, and you can see that I'm just sort of catching yarn A in behind the next colour, in behind yarn B, as I work this next stitch. This is good to do at the start of the row, especially where you have a column of stitches in the same colour. It just means that any gap that could appear between these stitches will be neatened up and tightened up with that little twist in the back. So I've done 2 in colour B, so now I'm on to colour A again. So drop that down, pick this up, and away we go. And that is the principle of the chart. You drop one colour, pick up another according to whatever you see in the next box on the chart. If you're a continental knitter and you hold your yarn in your left hand, then the idea is exactly the same. You drop the yarn you're finished with and pick up the one you want to use. Stretch it out, making sure you're not pulling the floats too tight at the back. Drop that one, pick up the other one, and if you really want to speed it up, you can try a combination of both, holding one strand in your left hand to pick or work continental style, and the other strand in your right hand to throw or do English style knitting. You'll notice when you knit in this way that the yarn you hold in your left hand is always carried at the bottom underneath the yarn you hold in your right hand. If you do this consistently all the time, you may find that you have an uneven tension, with the stitches made in the yarn on the left more prominent than the stitches made in the yarn held on the right. And in traditional Norwegian knitting, the tension of all the stitches should be as even as possible. So we're not aiming for one shade of yarn to be more prominent over another. So from time to time, just swap whichever yarn you're holding in your left hand, and don't be too consistent about always holding one yarn on the left and the other on the right. Just swap them around from time to time. You'll see when you get to row 5, and the same thing happens up here 5 rows from the top, that you have a row that only features yarn A. Yarn B isn't needed at all. So you could cut yarn B at the end of row 4 and rejoin it over here at the beginning of row 6 where it's needed again and weave in those ends. Or I'm going to show you how you can catch it in at the back of row 5. And this has the benefit not only of not needing to weave in extra ends, but it also means that you keep this row the same density or thickness as the rest of the chart, and it won't be just a thin row with just one strand of yarn being used. Every 3 or 4 stitches, I'm just going to catch yarn B in the back. So lay down yarn A, put yarn B over the top, pick up yarn A and knit 3 more stitches. Lay down yarn A, yarn B over the top and knit 3 or 4 more stitches. And just pull it apart every so often to make sure that yarn B isn't being pulled too tight to cause puckering in the back of your work. Make sure that there's plenty of space in there. And if you feel your yarns are getting twisted, you can always wrap it in the other direction and start untwisting the yarn as you go. So there we are, we've caught in yarn B on the back of that row and it's now in the right place to be starting row 6. There are a few places in the chart where you need to be aware of where you finish using yarn B in one row and then where you need it in the next row. For example, here you finish using yarn B there and then you're going to have to catch it in a couple of times to take it to the end of the row so that it's in the right place for the next row along. So it's just something to keep an eye on throughout the chart. And the only other thing to think about when you're catching in floats is that if you have an area where you're going to be catching in the same colour over several rows, just try not to do it in the same place on each row, because sometimes that can mean that the colour that you're trying to carry and hide in at the back will actually peep through and show to the front. So as I look at this, you can see this is where I carried a float last time in my last row. So I want to avoid catching it in at this point and at this point, and maybe catch it in somewhere, maybe on that stitch there. So I'm going to work along to the middle of the previous float, and these little red bits here, they're just from stitches in a previous row, so that's nothing to do with the float. You really want to look at where your float joins your knitting, actually touches your knitting, and avoid those spots. So we'll catch it in here, pull that out, lay the background yarn across the working yarn, work the next stitch, do a couple more just so that you can see, pull that out, and there you can see I've caught it halfway through the float on the previous row. And when you finish the chart, the pattern instructions tell you to cast off purlwise. So I'm going to purl one, purl another, lift the first stitch up over the second and repeat. You can either wait to weave in your ends once you've sewn your squares together, and that'll give you some nice seams to hide the ends in, or you can stay on top of the job and do it now. So I'm just going to hide this red end in amongst all the floats and stitches on the back of this square. So I've threaded it onto a tapestry needle, and this one has a sharp point just so that I can go in and split the yarn. So rather than going directly under every bit of yarn here, I can actually split the yarn and go into it, and that just makes it a little bit more secure. So I'm going to go under in one direction, making sure I'm not pulling too tight. I'll split that yarn a little, and then I'm going to come down here and go back in the other direction. Like that, and then I'll just make sure it's not tight, pull it apart a little bit, check it on the other side, make sure that there's no puckering, and then I'm going to trim that, leaving just about a centimetre spare. If you cut it too short, sometimes during the blocking process or when you're washing it, that end will peep through to the other side, so best to leave a little bit on the back there like that. And here's another job that you can get ahead with. Before we sew the squares together at the end of this project, each one needs to be blocked to size. To do this, lay each one onto a foam mat or an ironing board or somewhere else where they can lie undisturbed for a little while. Pin them out carefully without pulling too much, make sure that they're square and the right sizes, and then take a handheld steamer or a steam iron and gently waft some steam over the top. And this will allow the stitches to ease, the fibres to bloom, and you'll end up turning your curly stocking stitch square into a nice, flat, smooth, even square ready for sewing up.
So we would like to see what you're knitting and your projects, and if you want to put that out on social media, put the hashtag ARNE CARLOS festive so we can find you.
Right, and make sure to do that on Instagram, on YouTube if you want, on Facebook. And there is also the Rowan Connect Facebook group where we are going to join. So we really do want to see your progress. We want to see your beautiful squares. And also, if you decide to go rogue and do other colorways, we'd love to see that too.
Yeah. So hashtag
ARNE CARLOS festive.